Fresh Kills, for me, was an incredible sort of moment of a hidden history in this country that very few people witnessed. That was a very quiet side to what was just an enormous piece of American history. It was this crime scene in the backyard that no one knew about. After the Trade Center collapse, it was evident that the rescue workers would not be able to recover all the human remains at the site, given the complex activity at the World Trade Center. So they decided they needed an off-site location to do this. They considered two sites. Floyd Bennett Field was one. Right away they decided that it would be Fresh Kills, and they reopened 175 of the 2,200 acres. In the beginning, there were people that wanted the name of the landfill changed. They thought it was a morbid thing. But a kill is Dutch for a river, and so the name was kept. Many of the objects were just from everyday life and very sort of neutral objects that couldn't be identified with a person. You'd see stuffed dolls. These were souvenirs from the gift shops. An odd thing, one day we saw a cigar store Indian, a life-size carved Indian. It was very demolished but recognizable. We saw pieces of Rodin bronze. It was interesting, when they found the Rodin bronzes, they found a torso bronze with the head and feet cut off, and right away they thought they had found human remains, and it turned out to be a bronze piece. We saw lampposts. One day we were there, and there was this enormous pile of lampposts from one of the surrounding streets, and fire hydrants that had come over. So the material would come over every day in a barge, depending on where they were cleaning up downtown. So they knew at Fresh Kills if this was from very deep or from some part of the Trade Center. So sometimes they could sort of expect what they were finding, or what they were going to find. The smallest sort of things we would see, they'd find keys, and they saved any key that was marked the World Trade Center. And I think they saved, we probably saw about 200 or so keys. Another sort of things that we would see as elevator signs, little sign markers that mark floors of an elevator. They found 25 or 30 of these, which we were thrilled to see. When you think there was 99 elevators in each building and 110 floors, and they only found 25 of these little 3-inch signs, it wasn't very much. We were surprised when we got there, and it felt like a construction site. There was no one in uniform there. You didn't know who was who. The FBI agents were dressed like the sanitation workers, and everybody was moving around with this loud sound of bulldozers and backhoes and beeping. And at first, when I saw it, I thought they were moving mounds of dirt around with loaders. And what we were seeing was the ground remains of the World Trade Center. And it had a very organized sense to it. The material came in these buckets all together and put in one place, and then it was sorted. We saw nothing we could recognize in the fields. We expected to see chairs and file cabinets and what was left of offices. Everything was reduced to the finest state. It basically looked like mountains of dirt. There were hills of gray dirt, vast expanses of wire, twisted rebar, fields of steel, and the fields of vehicles. Probably the thing I remember the most at Fresh Kills was the FBI evidence shed. This is where they would bring the buckets of material that they would sort and find human remains or personal property. So we'd go in this little shed that had no air ventilation, so it smelled terrible. It smelled like death, and there would be a bucket of human remains and a bucket of personal property, and then a bucket of other objects that maybe they hadn't identified yet. In the open fields, you'd see the white suits slowly with their heads down, picking through the rubble or the wire or the mass of material there, looking for human remains. The main objective was to find DNA. That was the main mission of this whole operation of sorting through 1.8 million tons, were to find the smallest piece of a human to identify for a family. That was the main point. And so we would see these agents and detectives in these sorting sheds working on conveyor belts where the material would come off the fields, and they would sort it, and then they would pick through this, and they were really loud sheds. They called them sheds. They were open tents, and there would be 6 or 8 agents lined up along these conveyor belts with this ear-numbing sound of the machinery going, and these men and women would pick brown pieces off the conveyor belt. It was all one color. It was all like this brown-gray dirt. But they would see the shape of a bone or a human remain or something that was recognizable, and they would set it aside and put it in these big white buckets. And it would go on in the beginning for 24 hours a day. The personal property, the personal object, was all washed and cataloged very carefully as evidence. And they've made a great effort to return these to owners. Many of these were from people who were evacuated, but many of them were from people who died. The credit cards were very important because they didn't find remains of roughly half the people. So some people just got a credit card and were very appreciative. They would come up, families would come up and tour around, and they would give them these sorts of things. So you'd see, I remember seeing a frequent flyer card with a young woman's name on it. She had died, and that was a big deal. Those are the sort of things that stand out the most. We went into one area, which was the Building 6 sorting area, which is where U.S. Customs and Secret Service and some of the more sensitive areas were, where they found a lot of human remains from the towers, but there was also a lot of law enforcement, guns and vests and rifles and those sort of things, and they would sort of lay that all out in the field. Then the next time we were there, it was all gone. We saw seatbelt fragments. There was parts of armrests and seatbelts from the planes, and those were pretty compelling because you had no idea if this was a seatbelt from a flight attendant or from a terrorist. And you couldn't identify most of the material which plane the objects were from. They found a number of airplane parts at Fresh Kills. You could tell the fuselage pieces. They were these bright lime green colors. And there was a guy there from American Airlines who built airplanes. And what he did day in, day out is they would bring suspected piece of metal to him and decide if this was part of a plane. They found a very large wing section, probably 100 pieces of fuselage, some with windows in it still, and 2 of the engines. There were some of the plane tires as well. They weren't investigating this like a usual plane crash where they try to figure out why the planes crashed. They knew why these planes crashed, so it wasn't a safety issue. But they were very interested in keeping all the plane parts that they could find. Sometimes you would see a lot of shoes around. It seems like a small thing, but it was that was memorable. I was first there in late October 2002 was the first time. And they let us see a vehicle. They sent us around with a police department sort of chaperone. He escorted us around. He escorted us and wouldn't let us out of the vehicle. We couldn't take photographs. They told us if we took pictures, they'd take our cameras the first time in. And we saw the vehicles for the first time that day, and he drove us up and down the aisle. And there seemed to be 20 or 30, and we were astonished. And we returned a week or 2 later and saw probably twice that many. As they would bring them from downtown, every week there would be more and more. Within about 4 weeks, they had given me permission to begin taking photographs of just the vehicles. And so we would spend days there looking at them and photographing as much of them as we could. You'd return the next week, and there would be more of this seemingly endless stream of vehicles that were making their way to the hill, until there was about 100 of them. They found many human remains in these vehicles, and for some people, the contents of the glove compartments was all that the families would have. So the vehicles were especially important. One of the FBI agents called them sponges, that they somehow collected these remains and parts of people and part of their belongings, and so they were especially important, and they searched them every day for 10 months. A number of the destroyed vehicles had belonged to the U.S. Secret Service, FBI, undercover police department detectives, and these were treated very differently. They were sorted in a secure area within Fresh Kills where many of the detectives weren't even allowed to be. In every car, there was evidence of a life. The FBI was also very interested in searching every vehicle for evidence of connection to the hijackers. Every vehicle's VIN number was checked. They looked in the glove compartment and searched each car to find out if there was some activity on the ground from the terrorists, which there wasn't. The FDNY vehicles were remarkable. There were enormous ladder trucks, pumpers that looked like they were thrown around the fields like toys, and they reeked of unimaginable loss. For the most part, you got a sense of enormous weight, enormous structure in these trucks because they were built of such solid material. And when we went inside a number of them, and you'd find business cards blown in them from the trade center, pieces of steel, and then everyday things like somebody's shoes and a water bottle or a cooler in the back that still had water bottles in it. So there's an immediacy about them as well. That was just inescapable. We spent days with them. The vehicles were out of service. They were either so destroyed, there was nothing to be left of them. Some of the hose was scrapped and taken out, and they were going to recycle the metal. They were also contaminated, so they couldn't go back to any of the companies or back to the department. They did their best to find, any human remains, and these weren't remains of the firefighters, but from other people in the building. So they would go through them, find all the remains, wash them out, find anything they could, and then they tore them apart to recycle the metal, basically. So giant machinery would come in and tear them apart and tear the wheels off them, load it into backloaders and bring it down out to trucks and barges and take it away. So every week the fields got more organized and sort of sterilized as June and July went on until it was all gone. And they were done. The recovery operation ended as quietly as it began. The debris removal at Ground Zero ended on June 28th, and the sorting of fresh kills officially ended on July 26th at 1:07 p.m. They carefully documented that time because it was such an enormous task that they had accomplished in just about 10 months. They didn't know if it was going to take them 2 years to do this. In the end, of the 1.8 million tons, they found 4,257 human remains that led to the identification of over 400 people through DNA. Over 4,000 photographs, over 54,000 pieces of personal property, things that belonged to individuals, 54,000 pieces, and 1,358 vehicles, both civilian vehicles and department vehicles, were inspected and processed. When they were done, or nearly done, they went around and actually dug up the top 2 feet where all the sorting machines were in all the sheds and sorted all that material again and actually found more human remains and then put all that back out in the field to bury. So, in essence, the remains of the World Trade Center are underfoot at Fresh Kills. From that, they removed every reasonably sized human remain out and every personal object that they could find. But what's left is still underground. The minute we saw it, we thought it was important to save it and be seen. The minute we got there and wouldn't let us take our pictures, we planned to figure out a way to get back there and take photographs because we felt very strongly this is something that must be seen, must be saved. These images must be preserved somehow. Most people don't see a crime scene, and very few people saw that. So we think it's important for people to see kind of every piece of what happened.